Welcome to our economics revision sessions. This is the first session in our revision program, and we'll be looking at microeconomic economics part for a start. And so the syllabus for microeconomics can be summarized as follows. We have the introductory part, which is called the Introduction to Economic Concepts. The second part is the price theory. Then we go to the third, forms of businesses or business enterprises. The unit number 4 is the cost theory, and the last unit in the microeconomics part of our syllabus is market structures. Let's look at how our revision program looks like. We have 4 days of revisions looking at the topics that we have covered in our syllabuses, and today being the 12th of May 2020, we're supposed to cover the introduction to economic concepts and the price theory. And then on the 14th, we'll look at the cost theory and market structures. That will conclude the first part of our syllabus, which is microeconomics. And then on the 16th, we'll start looking at the macroeconomics. We intend to finish that in 2 days as well. On the 16th, we'll look at the national income, financial environment of business. And on the 18th, we are going to conclude by looking at the international sector and government macroeconomic policies. When we are done looking at reviewing the topics, we are going to have our first mock exam, which is scheduled for 19th of May 2020. The time will be communicated to you via our WhatsApp group. And then after that mock exam, the following day, 20th of May, we will have a video or a session to review our mock exam. And then on the 21st, we sit for the second mock exam. The 22nd, we review our last mock exam. We intend to conclude our economics revisions on the 22nd of May 2020, after which I will still be available to respond to queries and questions and to continue to interact until you sit for your exams in June. So let's start with our first part. In this particular video, I'm covering the introduction to economic concepts. The introduction to economic concepts. That's what we are covering. So this is how we are going to be doing our revisions. First, I'll begin by going through the notes to just remind you of the things that you might have forgotten, and then we look at the exam questions. So in this first video, I've got about 4 or 5 big questions that I want us to cover. But before we start looking at those questions relating to microeconomics concepts, I would love us to go through the notes and just remind ourselves of the things we have covered in class, all the things that we have read. So let's start with our definition for economics. Economics is defined as the study of how society uses scarce resources to achieve maximum benefit. The other definition you can use is economics is concerned with how choices are made about the use of scarce resources. Or you can as well say economics studies the way in which society decides what to produce, how to produce, and who should consume it. So if you look at this definition critically, you'll find that the definition itself reviews what is called the economic problem. So what's the economic problem? The economic problem is that resources are scarce, human wants are unlimited. So we have the problem of allocating limited resources to satisfy potentially unlimited wants. Economics can be broken down into two many disciplines. These are macroeconomics and microeconomics. So macroeconomics focuses on how individual consumers and firms make decisions. These individual consumers or firms can be a single person or the entire household. So that's microeconomics. So microeconomics focuses on how individual consumers and firms make decisions. The other discipline, main discipline of economics, macroeconomics. Macroeconomics studies the overall economy on both the national and international level. In other words, macroeconomics studies the aggregate effects of the decisions of economic units. So our syllabus for economics is divided into those two types of economics, the microeconomics and the macroeconomics, of course. So we in this particular video we are revising microeconomics. We'll look at macroeconomics in our other videos. So let's start with our Unit 1, Introduction to Economic Concepts. Introduction to Economic Concepts. This unit introduces us to the study of economics and how scarce resources are located amongst unlimited ones. The aim, of course, what you should be focusing as you are looking at this particular unit is you must understand the economic problem and be able to explain scarcity, the concept of opportunity cost, and of course the PPF is a very, very important aspect of this unit of the syllabus. So, economic problem. What is the economic problem? The economic problem is a problem of allocating limited resources to satisfy potentially unlimited ones. The economic problem can be explained using the following terms. Number one, you explain economic problem using the factors of production, scarcity, choices, and opportunity cost. You must be able to explain factors of production. You must be able to explain clearly scarcity and how choices are necessitated because of the limitation of the resources, and how opportunity cost arises as a result of making choices. So let me just run through the four concepts. Factors of production. These are resources of an economy, and these resources are divided into four categories or four groups. We have land, which includes natural resources. We have labor, that's human resource. We have capital, and we have enterprise. Those are the resources we are talking about, the resources of the economy. But you see, these resources are limited in supply. They are scarce. Scarcity means that we have excess of ones over what actually can be produced. So these resources that are used to produce goods and services that are consumed by human beings, the resources are limited, but the wants are unlimited. So scarcity means we have excess of wants over what can actually be produced. In other words, we are simply saying a resource is said to be scarce if its demand at zero price will exceed its available supply. Choices are necessitated because of scarcity of resources. Choices are only necessary because resources are what? Scarce. These choices are reflected in three fundamental questions. What to produce? Because if resources are scarce, you can't produce everything you want. So you need to choose what to produce, how to produce and who will benefit from what is produced. Opportunity cost refers to whatever must be given up to obtain something. That's an opportunity cost. It is the value of the next best foregone alternative that could have been chosen but was not chosen. An opportunity cost is simply an implicit cost. It's not like the accounting cost, which is explicit. So when we say there is an opportunity cost here, that opportunity cost only arises because you've made a choice of one alternative and you have forgone the benefit in the next best alternative that could have been chosen. Let's look at how the PPF can be explained. Production Possibility Frontier, PPF. The PPF illustrates very important economic concepts, which includes the scarcity of resources choices, opportunity cost, technical efficiency of resource allocations, and unemployment. So let's assume in an economy we only produce pizza and sugar. The PPF that can help us explain scarcity of resources choices, opportunity cost, and technical efficiency of resource allocation and unemployment can be demonstrated using the PPF. So if you look at this PPF, the vertical line here represents the output for pizza. The horizontal line represents the output for sugar. Then we have output levels D and E. Any output level inside the PPF signifies inefficient use of resources. If we use all our available resources to produce goods and services, we can produce up to the frontier, up to the line. So any output below the frontier, that's the output inside the PPF, represents higher levels of unemployment and inefficient use of resources. Any output outside the PPF means that output is unattainable with the current resources or with the available resources. However, if there is an expansion in the resources or economic growth takes place, the country can produce up to F. What this means is this: if there is economic growth, the PPF shifts outwards. So we can produce F only if we have an increase in the quantity and the quality of our resources. Otherwise, with the current resources, we can only produce up to the frontier. This is the maximum or efficient output level up to the frontier. So ABC represents efficient output levels. F represents unattainable with the current resources unless economic growth takes place. D and E represents inefficient use of resources and high levels of unemployment. Characteristics of the PPF. The PPF defines what is achievable if all production resources are fully employed. For example, the PPF we are looking at here, if all the resources are fully employed, we can produce up to that level. That's what the PPF defines. Number two, the PPF characteristic number two, changes in the levels of unemployment have got no effect upon it. Why? Because the PPF shows what can potentially be produced if all resources are put to use. That's what the PPF is signifying. So changes in the levels of unemployment will have no effect on the PPF. Changes in the price level will not affect the PPF either. Why? Changes in the price levels only affects the monetary value of what is produced, not the volume of what is produced. The PPF signifies the volume of output if all resources were put to good use. That's what the PPF signifies. The other idea that you need to remember before you walk in that exam room is the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns. Diminishing returns refers to a situation where a firm is trying to expand by using more of its variable resources or factors, but finds that the extra output they get each time they add one more variable factor to a fixed factor of production gets progressively less and less. That's what diminishing returns is all about. If you are adding a variable resource to a fixed resource, you'll find that the extra returns you get every time you add an extra variable resource to a fixed resource tends to diminish progressively. That's what diminishing returns is all about. The other concept you need to remember is the idea of externality. What is an externality? An externality is an economic term referring to a cost or benefit incurred or received by the third party. However, the third party has no control over the creation of that cost or benefit. So an externality can either be a positive externality or a negative externality, and it can stem from either production or consumption of a good or service. The cost and benefit. The cost and benefit can be private to an individual or organization, or can be social, meaning that it affects society as a whole. So looking at examples of positive externalities, we have examples such as education, immunization against things like polio. Today we can talk about immunization against COVID-19. Those can be examples of positive externality because it brings the benefit on society as a whole. What are examples of negative externalities? Examples of negative externalities includes things like pollution, public smoking, and noise, because those affect the entire society negatively. So pollution emitted by a factory that pollutes the surrounding environment and affects the health of the nearby residents is an example of a negative externalities. The effect of a well-educated labor force on productivity of a company is an example of a positive externality. Now, when we are talking about negative externalities, the common example that is used is pollution, because that's what we usually experience in society, pollution coming from factories. So let's look at the other terminologies that we should be able to understand and properly define. It includes, number one, market failure. Market failure, what is a market failure? Market failure is the failure of the market to produce a satisfactory allocation of scarce resources. Failure of a market to produce a satisfactory allocation of scarce resources. Social cost is the total cost to society as a whole of using economic resources. Social benefits is the total gain to society as a whole flowing from economic decisions. Private cost is the cost to the firm of using economic resources. Private benefit obtained directly by a producer or consumer from the consumption of resources. Externalities, these are spillover effects of economic transactions, and we have already said that externalities can either be positive or negative externalities, and externalities are also can also be explained as a difference between private and social cost. So when we have the social cost higher than the private cost, we have a negative externality. If the social cost is less than the private cost, we have a positive externality. Public goods, these are goods that are provided for public consumption regardless of whether one has paid for them or not. The examples of public goods includes roads, street lights, etc. Merit goods, these are goods that are considered to be beneficial to society. Goods like education, healthy care, etc. The difference between public goods and merit goods is that public goods are indivisible. You can't divide a public good amongst the consumers. For example, you can't divide a road amongst consumers. You can't divide street lights amongst consumers. But merit goods are divisible, meaning that you can divide merit goods. For example, if you are talking about education, you can share a desk to a particular consumer, give a desk to a particular consumer. Healthcare medicines can be divided amongst different consumers, or hospital beds can be allocated to a particular consumer or client. The graph are showing negative externality. We've said negative externality happens where social cost is higher than the private cost. So if you look at this graph, this marginal social cost is higher than the marginal private cost, and hence we have an externality, which is the gap between social cost and marginal cost. And so the equilibrium point B shows that there is a negative externality because equilibrium point B is an intersection for marginal private cost and marginal social benefit. For us to have a healthy equilibrium, in this case, we must be looking at equilibrium point A, where marginal social cost equals to marginal social benefits. This is the proper equilibrium that we should have. Let's look at the policies the government can use to minimize negative externalities or control negative externalities. This can come in form of government regulations, but let's look at what government can do. Number one, government can either charge taxes to firms that are emitting negative externalities, like firms that are polluting, charge taxes, or government can subsidize technologies that reduces the emission of pollutants or completely eliminates emission of pollutants. So taxes increases the cost of production of a good or service. That's encouraging the firms to reduce output. So when you charge a tax, you make production expensive, and that will force firms to reduce output levels. And as output levels are reduced, emissions, negative externalities will be reduced as well. Subsidy may be granted to generators of positive externalities to ensure a higher level of consumption or production than would arise through the completely free interaction of the markets. So government may choose to subsidize producers of positive externalities to encourage consumption of what is produced, and also to encourage production of those units of cost that leads to a positive externality. Pollution permits. What are pollution permits? Pollution permits. Each permit entitles the order to emit 1 unit of pollutant during a specified period of time. Permits can be bought and sold at whatever price the participants agree on. And the advantage of pollution permits over mere regulation is that we get the same overall level of environmental quality at a lower cost, since those power plants that find it inexpensive or less expensive to reduce emissions will do so and sell the permits to those power plants that have higher cost of reducing the permits. The other thing that government can do is to assign property rights. Property rights, this means government is giving someone ownership of the resources, and that gives them an incentive to manage the resource in a way that maximizes its value. The fifth, government can introduce an emission standard for firms. Emission standards for firms. This entails setting a maximum level of emissions that the firm will be allowed to release. Lastly, government can also introduce emission fees. Emission fees can be charged on each unit of the firm's emission. Under this regulation, government needs to have the instruments to measure the levels of emissions. Let's talk about economic growth. Economic growth simply means increase in the real GDP of an economy, or increase in the productive capacity of the economy. And this can arise from things like good investment climate, access to capital, increase in population, improved technology, and things like that. The reasons for inefficiency is simply lack of technology. Lack of technology is the major reason for inefficiency. And again, for your exam purposes, you need to remember the benefits of economic growth, drawbacks to economic growth, and things like that. Stages of economic development. Stages of economic growth. It's also called, because it was developed by Rostow, it's called the Rostow's takeoff model. So Rostow's stages of development, or stages of economic development, includes traditional society stage. Then we have the preconditions for takeoff, the takeoff, drive to maturity, and high mass consumption. You must be able to explain all these stages. And actually, there is a question that we are going to look at that required students to explain the stages. Let me just run through the stages before we look at that particular question. Traditional society, at this stage, the economy is dominated by subsistence activities, where output is consumed by producers rather than traded. Any trade at this stage is carried out by barter system. Agriculture is the most important industry at this particular stage, and production is highly labor intensive. When we move to preconditions for takeoff stage, there is increased specialization, which generates, of course, surplus for trading. There is an emergence of transport infrastructure to support trade. And then as income, savings, and investment grow, entrepreneurs also emerge. External trade occurs, concentrating, of course, on primary products. When we move to stage 3, which is the takeoff, there is industrialization increase, with workers switching from agricultural sector to manufacturing sector. Growth is concentrated in few regions of the country. Then when you move to drive to maturity stage number 4, the economy begins to diversify in new areas. Technological innovation provides a diverse range of investment opportunities. The economy is producing a wider range of goods and services, and there is less reliance on imports. Then when you move to the last stage, which is called high mass consumption, the economy is geared towards mass consumption. The consumer durable industry flourish. The service sector becomes increasingly dominant. Having said all the things that we have said, now let's look at some few questions and see how we can answer these questions. So question number 1, it's coming from June 2018 final exam, Zika 1.3 Business Economics. So let's read the question and see how we can answer this question. According to Rostow, development requires substantial investment in capital and less developed countries to grow. Let me read that again. According to Rostow, development requires substantial investment in capital and less developed countries to grow. The right conditions must be created. The government of Zambia, under the Vision 2030, seeks to develop the Zambian economy towards the status of a prosperous middle-income country by 2030. As industrialization increases, externalities of production and consumption also increase, and the social efficiency level of output and price would be at a level where external costs were taken into account. So required, describe the 5 stages of development of industrialized economies according to Rostow. So that's what I just talked about. So 5 stages, 10 marks. They will give you 2 marks for explaining the stage, each stage. So when you mention the stage, 1 mark. When you explain it, you win the other mark. So 5 stages. Let's remind ourselves of the 5 stages. We have the traditional society stage, precondition for taking off, takeoff, drive to maturity, and high mass consumption. So, traditional society, we said the economy is dominated by subsistence activities where output is consumed by the producer rather than traded. And then a trade at this stage is carried out by barter system, where goods are exchanged directly for other goods. Agriculture is the most important industry at this stage, and production is highly labor intensive. Stage number 2, preconditions for takeoff. Under this stage, there is an increased specialization which generates surplus for trading. There is an emergence of transport industry or infrastructure to support trade. Entrepreneurs emerge. External trade also occurs, concentrating on primary products. Stage number 3, takeoff. Industrialization increase with workers switching from agricultural sector to manufacturing sector. Growth is concentrated in few regions of the country, and the level of investment increases. And it's estimated that when the levels of investment increase, touching about 10% of the GDP, then we are at the 3rd stage of economic development. The 4th stage, drive to maturity. The economy is now diversifying into new areas. Technological innovation is providing a diverse range of investment opportunities. The economy is producing a wider range of goods and services, and there is less reliance on imports. Then when we move to high mass consumption, the economy is geared towards mass consumption. The consumer durable industry begins to flourish. The service sector becomes increasingly dominant. Then that indicates that the economy has reached a high mass consumption stage. Question B. Distinguish the term negative externalities from positive externalities in consumption. I said externalities can either be positive or negative, and externalities can either come from production or consumption. This particular question focuses on externalities in consumption, not production. So you got to be careful when you are giving examples here. Do not use examples that relate to production in terms of externalities. Use externalities examples that relate to consumption. So let's start. A negative externality in consumption occurs when the marginal social benefit of consuming something is less than the marginal private benefit. An example would be when people use their cars, other people suffer from exhaust fumes that come from cars. You see, the example that I've given relates to consumption. When you are using a car, other people suffer from the exhaust fumes of that car. So meaning that the social cost that comes on society is much higher than the private cost of using that particular car. The second example you can use is when someone is playing their radio loud in the public place. It tends to inconvenience or disrupt others. That's another example of a negative externality from consumption. Positive externality. Positive externality in consumption occurs when the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit. An example is when an individual pays for a private health care treatment for a contagious disease like coronavirus, which prevents the spread of the disease to others. That's an example of a positive externality. Or the other example could be when one gets an education. The private benefit is that you are educated, but the fact that you are educated will bring much benefits to society as well. So that becomes an example of a positive externality. Let's look at the last part of the question. Outline any three policies the government can put in place to deal with the externalities. Now, to deal with the externalities, this question was a little bit general. Policies that can be put in place to deal with externalities. Externalities can either be positive or negative. But you see, one of the major concerns of society is that some negative externalities impact society in a very negative way at a higher level. So let's see at some policies government can put in place to deal with externalities. 6 marks suggests that you'll be given 1 mark for mentioning the policy. You'll be given another mark for explaining that policy. So you have to be able to maximize the marks. Okay, so policies. Number 1, government can use taxes or subsidies. We've talked about that. Tax makes production expensive, and so it forces producers to reduce production of such industries that causes negative externalities. Or number two, government can choose to subsidize those industries that produce positive externalities. Or government can choose to apply pollution permits where orders where industries are given permits that entitles them to emit 1 unit of a pollutant specified during some specific periods of time. And permits, as we have already said, permits can be bought and sold at whatever price the participants agree on. Or government can choose to assign property rights. Giving someone ownership of a resource gives them an incentive to manage that resource in a way that maximizes its value. So government can use either of those policies to deal with externalities. So that's how that question was supposed to be tackled. And if you do that, you'll be able to maximize your scores. Let's look at the second question. This is also coming from December 2017 Business Economics CA 1.3, and it was a compulsory question. So let's read the question. In many market economies, Zambia inclusive, the private sector is the key engine or driver of economic growth. The aim of the private business is to maximize profits. However, this may come at a cost to the environment. Firms do business while government's main role is to create an enabling environment for the private sector to flourish. Government does this by enacting economic policies and through regulations. In the light of the above, answer the following questions. Explain market failure. What is market failure? We've already talked about it in our previews. Market failure is a situation in which market equilibrium results in too few or too many resources used in the production of a good or services. In short, market failure is the failure by a free market mechanism to produce the most efficient allocation of scarce resources. Number two, explain how government can use each of the following mechanisms to control air pollution. You see, air pollution is an example of a negative externality. Air pollution is an example of negative externalities. So the list there, tradable permits, emission taxes, government regulations, these are policies government can use to control negative externalities. So let's start. Tradable permits. What are tradable permits? This is where maximum permitted levels are set for a specific pollutants, and a firm is given a permit to emit up to that level of pollution. If the firm emits below its limit, it is given a credit for the difference, which it can then sell to a firm which needs to go above its limit or permitted levels of pollution. Tradable permits are used in relation to carbon dioxide emissions, with the result that firms can now engage in carbon trading. So the firm that can minimize its pollution is encouraged to do so and sell the permits to other firms that may not manage to reduce or that needs to go above the limits that are set for pollution. Number two, emission taxes. Emission taxes or polluter pay principle. This is the tax that is levied on polluters, equal to the cost of removing the effects of the externality they generate. This tax forces polluters to reduce production or change their production techniques so as to minimize their tax payment, hence pollution will be minimized. The third one, government regulations. Government regulation could set limits for the maximum permitted levels of emission or for the minimum levels of environmental quality. Firms which breach these limits or regulations can be fined. So that's government regulation. Right. So let's look at the next question. The next question is coming from the December 2017 final exam. This is DA3 Business Economics. The question says, identify and describe any 5 essential conditions which are necessary for economic growth to be obtained. This question talks about economic growth. What are the necessary conditions which leads to economic growth? So let's look at some of the conditions, essential conditions which are necessary for economic growth. Number 1, it's the availability of resources, factors of production. Availability of resources or factors of production. A country can develop if it is well endowed with factors of production like natural resources, minerals, available land, human resource, high labor skills, capital resources, etc. And if the country uses these efficiently, they are able to achieve economic growth. Second condition that must prevail to support economic growth is the infrastructure. A country can develop when it puts into place the necessary social and physical infrastructure, such as access to clean water, access to good health care, road networks, buildings, and other things, bridges, etc. If the infrastructure is set, then the country can easily achieve its economic growth. Third condition is access to capital. Countries with good trade links are likely to attain economic development because they can expand their access to bigger markets, which includes the foreign demand. So let me come again on that point. That's point number 3. Condition is access, rather instead of access to capital, it's access to markets. Access to markets supports economic growth because countries that have got access to a wider market are able to produce more and, of course, trade or export more of its outputs. The fourth condition that supports economic growth is good investment climate. When a country has an environment characterized by factors like macroeconomic stability, political stability, the stable rule of laws, favorable tax systems, and the protection of property rights, such countries will be able to attract high investment levels, and hence economic growth will be easily achieved. Then we have also the access to capital. Development requires that resources are devoted to projects like construction of roads, communication systems, and other things. Such projects requires huge capital investments. A country which does not have access to capital or cannot borrow from the international financial institutions will not be able to engage in big projects, and so economic growth will be limited for such countries. So let me just go through again just to ensure we get the right thing here. Conditions that are necessary for economic growth includes availability of resources, infrastructure, access to market, good investment climate, and access to capital. Right. Now let me look at another question. This question came in June 2015, Business Economics. By that time it was called D4, which is now DA3. So let's look at this question. I'll get it direct from the question paper. This is question 1, question 1C. Question 1C. Use the production possibility curve below. Country Z is producing two goods, A and B. Find the opportunity cost of country Z producing 90 units of good B instead of 70 units. So when you come to the PPF shown here, quantity of good B is the vertical line, quantity of good A is the horizontal line. What's the opportunity cost? Benefits foregone in the next best alternative that could have been chosen. So what would be the benefits foregone? That's an opportunity cost of country Z producing at 90 instead of 70. So country Z moving B's production from 70 to 90, or in other words, moving from Y to X. So from 70 to 90, this will result in a drop in the quantity of A produced from 80 to 70. If you have noticed, from 70 to 90, the benefits foregone will be the production of quantity A from 80 to 70. That's the 10 units of quantity A that should be given up. The other way you can work out this is like this. Let me show you the other way. Opportunity cost equals change in B's output over change in A's output. So change in B's output divided by change in A's output. Divided by change in A's output. So if you go back to our PPF, what's the change in B's output over what's the change in A's output? The change in B's output is 90 minus 70. It's B2 minus B1. The change in A's output is A2 minus A1, so 70 minus 80. So this is going to be 90 minus 70 divided by 70 minus 80. Tap that in the calculator, you have 20 over negative 10. You have 20 over negative 10. Reduced to lowest terms, you have 1 over negative 0.5. That's the opportunity cost. So what's the interpretation of that? The interpretation of that is to produce 1 extra unit of B, country Z will have to sacrifice the production of 0.5 units of good A. That's country Z produces 20 extra units of B at the expense of 10 extra units of A. So going back to our PPF, this is what you see. Country Z increases the production of B by 20 units at the expense of quantity of A produced of 10 units. So the opportunity cost is 10 units of A lost. B, outline the economic implication of Z to produce at T. Now T output, you are producing inside the PPF. You are producing inside the PPF. We have said that signifies inefficiency and unemployment. So for country Z to produce at T, it would mean that such a combination is inefficient. The implication are that the production techniques being employed are costly as their available resources are not used properly. Another implication may be that there is underutilization of what? Resources, as some resources are lying idle. That's expected. So to produce the maximum attainable combination of goods and services, country Z must produce along the PPF, which is X and Y. You must produce along the PPF for you to maximize the output. All right. So that's the question I wanted to pick from T4 2015 June exam, just to try and spice up our revision for today. So thank you so much. This concludes the first part of today's revision, looking at the introductory concept to economics. I intend to look at the other part in the other video because I have to cut the videos into manageable sizes. I'll look at the price theory in another video. Thank you so much for your time.